안녕하세요. 그리고 환영합니다 to our episode, to our show, A Drink with the Past, featuring your hosts,
Martin.
and Jose. On today's episode, we're going to immerse ourselves into Korean history with an emphasis to the March 1st movement. Our drinks for this episode is Jinro, peach, and chamizu original flavored soju. So I'm going to go ahead and pour some into our cups. Say when. Alright. Thank you guys for those that have listened to our episode. Now, so settle in and gongbae as we take a drink with the past.
Gongbae.
Gongbae.
Yeah. Has a really sweet peach flavor to it. Now I see what you mean, because this is actually my first time having the peach flavored one.
Yeah, I usually get, I like this flavor. It's very, very much my style for sure. If I ever do have alcohol, because I'm usually more of a wine person.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice to have like a cocktail, like, you know, more like the flavor one. But like, if you just want to just have like a really chill time with like friends or even by yourself, then I highly recommend drinking either the original or the fresh, right? If it's just, you know, if you don't want that flavory type of soju, just go with the original one. And you want to know, fun fact, well, this is just like speculations, or like more like a, you know, like a thing where it said like, if you drink soju, right, when you take that first like drink of soju, if it's sweet, that means you had a good day. But if it tastes better, that means that you kind of had like a bad day. I don't know. That's peach flavor.
Wait, but you're talking about if it's...
I'm talking about like
the original one?
Like the original one.
Oh.
Like if you just like drink it like plainly, if you drink like the original one, or even like the fresh one, like I don't know. I saw that from a show and from a show on Netflix. Like, but anyway, that's kind of what I always do every time I have Korean barbecue with my friends out in like Rancho Cucamonga. You know, I always would say every time I drink the soju, I'll be like, oh yeah, it's fresh today, like it's smooth. It means I had a good day.
I know, I was about to say, when you were talking about soju, like I thought it was with any flavor, so I was like, this is really sweet. I feel like today was a good day, but since you said it was original,
well, I mean, it could be flavor too at this point also. I mean, well, you had a good day or you didn't.
I mean, it's been a good day-ish so far. I guess you could say if the rumors are true with that it's supposed to be sweet when you know you had a good day. So, I mean, yeah, it's been alright. How about you?
Yeah, it's been a good day for me as well. I mean, didn't do nothing much, but, you know, just relax, you know, just spending these last 2 days before, you know, I head back to work after my week-long break. So, yeah.
Okay. So you brought this topic up. What do you have in mind for today's March 1st movement episode?
So really, what I really want to talk to you about, and what I want to really let out into the world to our listeners, is that Korea has had such a unique history during the 20th century, right? Basically, whatever happened in Korea in the late 19th and early 20th century is what really made Korea into the country that it is today. Right, in the region itself, both North and South Korea, the early 20th century, all the events that happened was really what made it into the region it is to this day. And one of those particular events that happened was the March 1st movement that every Korean knows about. They celebrated, they are taught about this in schools. So really, the March 1st movement is one of those key events in Korean history that really, I think, should be known to people. And it all has to come down to like topics of colonialism, really.
That was the start of colonialism?
well, not the start of colonialism, but like in general, just like colonial in general in history, really,
Okay.
and especially about colonialism within Asia.
I mean, you've been to Korea more times than I have ever gone. Me being 0 and you being more than once.
Yeah, I mean, Korea, South Korea. I traveled there twice. Amazing each time I visited. It's just an amazing country. The people are amazing. They have amazing, the cities are beautiful, countryside is beautiful, and there's just a lot of history in Korea. Not just, yes, you have K-pop, obviously, go BTS.
Let's Seraphim.
You have K-pop, and you have K-dramas. Obviously, it's become such a big trend, which I love. I love watching K-dramas and movies, etc. Right, but it's just more than that, right? The culture of today, but the thing is, a lot of Koreans still hold on to like their past. They know who they are, they know where they come from, and it's really just a beautiful thing to have experienced, actually have gone to Korea twice. And when I went those 2 times, like the first time I was amazed. I was just amazed of how the country was in general, how the culture was like, and how awesome the food was, of course. Oh god, the food is so amazing.
In terms of the environment compared to here, how would you rate it as on a scale of 1 to 10 compared to here?
What do you mean by environment?
Like the general environment, the atmosphere that you get when you go to South Korea. How would you rate it as?
Honestly, in my opinion, the environment over there is like a 10. I would give it a 10 because just because how different it is compared to like having lived in America for all my life, and having gone to my first country that was not in the Americas, because I've been to Mexico a couple of times, but to have gone to a country on the other side of the ocean was just a big like thing for me, really, and I actually enjoyed it a lot. And like I said, the people are very respectful over there. A lot of good food, a lot of good places to visit, and it's a good place for people who want to know more about Korean history to go to, because everywhere you go, especially in Seoul, the capital, history is like, it's like everywhere around you. So
Interesting. Okay.
basically, yeah.
So, what history topics do you want to cover today in regards to the 19th century?
So first of all, the thing we have to know before getting into the March 1st movement, right, and before getting to understanding of how Korea was like under the Japanese occupation, was we got to go back to the 19th century, right? We got to go back like almost a century before the colonization of the country of Korea. So first off, let's start off with China. So first off, China have been struggling with defeat from European powers from the first Opium Wars of 1939 to 42, and then again with the second Opium Wars of 1856 and 60. And basically, it ended up forcing China to have more open ports for foreign trade in basically any port unfortunately, it was through unequal treaties that were signed by, Western powers.
And they
China.
had to? You said they had to open more?
Yeah, after the Opium Wars, because trade was only limited to the port city of Guangzhou only. That was the only place Westerners were allowed to like operate trade in Guangzhou. But then after the Opium Wars ended, that was through the signing of like unequal treaties, China was forced to have more ports open. So examples like Shanghai and Hong Kong, etc.
Okay.
And obviously this was also where the secession of Hong Kong to the British took place, in which Hong Kong would become a British colony until 1997. And then China realized that they had to westernize more, mainly more like on the military side. So, they had to westernize their military, have a modern navy, etc.
Okay.
So that was China. So that was what happening in China. And Japan, though, Japan was lucky because unlike, China, like Japan did not face colonialism from Western powers. So, so Japan was not colonized because in the end they agreed to westernize themselves.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they basically just agreed to amongst themselves, like, hey, we got to westernize. We got to bring in Western ideas and technology. We got to learn from them, etc. And they would sign a lot treaties with a lot of the Western countries, the powerful countries at the time. So the U.S., Great Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, Germany, the Netherlands, etc. Right? They signed treaties with them, and so in comes 1868, which was the beginning of the Meiji Restoration movement. So this was after the victory of the Shosu alliances that ended 2.5 centuries of the Tokugawa shogunate rule in Japan and would place the emperor back in power. And so
Tokugawa shogunate sounds familiar to, like, the name is somewhere burrowed in my brain back in high school, at least that phrase. But as far as that, I mean, Chosu for sure, but so I don't know.
So the Shosu alliance was basically just an alliance of samurais from two different domains in southern Japan that wanted to support the emperor to being back in power and getting rid of the shogunate, because the shogunate was too comfortable with the Westerners. They were too comfortable in trying to westernize Japan, and they didn't want it.
So you say the Chosu, and what was the other one that you said? It's just the Chosu, right?
Yeah, because it was just an alliance between.
So you would say like they're like the rebels of democratization in Japan, as compared to the Tokugawa shogunate.
At first they were, but then they eventually had to, because after seeing the strength of Western countries, that's where they took a different approach. Like, okay, yeah, we gotta westernize, but that's another episode. That's enough. That'll be another episode, and trust me, I got a lot to talk about that. And so, Japan modernizes, right, militarily, politically. Right, Japanese are already dressing up in Western clothing. So that was Japan. Korea, though, I would have to say that was a country that did not get to modernizing right away. All right.
Why?
Korea was not a country that immediately opened its arms to the idea of modernizing and westernizing their country right away, because
of what happened with China itself.
Well, no,
or something.
It had to do with China. But it was because of they were so conservative. Like they were like, Koreans in those days were so conservative. They practiced Neo-Confucianism, so they had a strong belief of Neo-Confucianism and to basically do influence from China. But they did have Western influence, but it wasn't enough back then. Like, they weren't doing it in a faster pace, but ultimately it also had to do with the introduction of Christianity into Korea as well. And
so you would say because of Christianity they didn't want to democratize at that point, like, fully?
Part of the reason. It was part of the reason, but not like so much, but it was just a little part of the reason. And of course there were many attempts to have Korea opened up trade with the rest of the world, right? But it wasn't until 1882 when Korea ended up deciding to sign a treaty with the U.S., with the U.S. being the first Western country to have a treaty signed with Korea for trade only. So they were the first. So U.S. was the first Western country, but
they only wanted open trade, but nothing political, nothing
like
diplomatic.
Yeah, it was trade and diplomatic. It was at the same time, because this was in the 1880s. So yeah, that was like the same time, diplomatic and trade. But their first Western style treaty that they signed was in 1876 with Japan, actually.
Okay.
So they signed the first like Western style treaty with them, and it was because Japan did the same thing to Korea like we did with them in 1853 with Matthew Perry.
Matthew Perry.
With Commodore Matthew Perry when he came to Japan on his, as the Japanese called it, the black ships.
Okay. Now I remember.
Now you kind of.
I feel like I'm somehow
comes
the soju kind of messed with my connection, but now I could. It's coming back in little fragments, but I can piece it together somehow.
Yeah, so basically the Japanese did the same thing to Korea, what we did with them, which is basically like showing like force, like kind of like intimidating them, and then all of a sudden Korea ends up signing a treaty with Japan, right, etc. So
Okay.
so basically, yeah, and
So we're in 1882. What happens after that?
so
They signed the treaty with the
So
U.S.
it ends up slowly. So then, after the treaty is signed, more Western countries end up signing their own treaties with Korea, right? And so Korea ends up setting up legations of these different countries within Seoul, the capital. And unfortunately, right, there were some people who still resisted westernization of the country. So there are, revolts, rebellions, most notably the Donghak Rebellion, which basically was led by a group of peasants who wanted to basically have their country back and to run the country the way they wanted to without like Japanese or Western influences in the country, basically.
Is this because of their ideology with at the time? So that way,
Basically, yeah,
because of how peasants would now have to be treated differently instead of being treated equally at that point in time. With like pay wise and
Not so much pay wise, because they also wanted to get rid of the hierarchy too.
Okay.
So it was kind of more like anarchy per se. You can kind of call it like anarchy, but it was quickly brought down with the help of China and Japan, right? So actually a specific figure, King Gojong, who was the last king of the Joseon dynasty, was at first hesitant to introduce Western ideas and technology to the country.
That's what I was saying. So they were initially like the rebels of democracy.
Basically. Eventually, he agreed to allow Western thought to enter the country with the means of catching up with China and Japan. Because at this point, Japan had basically westernized and modernized quickly at that point. It literally took 30 years for Japan to fully catch up with like the rest of the Western world to actually be able to modernize the country. It literally took them like 30 years. And so and so then Gojong wanted to introduce the Western ideas in because he wanted to catch up with China and Japan militarily and technologically, and having to put down a few peasant uprisings. And of course, like I said, with the help of China and Japan, Korea was beginning to show that at first it wasn't capable of truly becoming independent, but that was only because Korea was a tributary state of China.
Wait, say that again. Korea is a tributary.
Korea was a tributary state to China, also known as Qing, right? The Qing Empire.
Oh.
To the Manchus, right?
Oh, okay.
So even though Korea was considered a country, like it wasn't part of China, they were allowed to have like a king and run the country, the way they've always ran the country. They had to pay tribute to the Qing, to the Manchu rulers of China.
Is it because they still had like diplomatic control over Korea at that point in time?
Yeah, China, they did have some diplomatic control, but not always. Korea had always been autonomous in a sense, yeah. Basically, yeah. But then it all changed when the first Sino-Japanese War happens.
Okay.
So in 1894 to 95, like almost a year long. So basically, Japan defeats China in less than a year. And because of this, China, in one of the agreements on the treaty, China was forced to recognize Korean independence. So no longer was Korea going to be a tributary state to China. They were now independent. And 1895 was also the year that Gojong's wife, Queen Min, would be assassinated by Japanese Ronin in a pavilion in Gyeongbokgung, or Gyeongbok Palace, Kung being the Korean word for palace, because she showed support more for China. She was pro-Chinese.
She was the only one that wanted to keep China or Korea as a tributary?
Not as a tributary state. It's not that she wanted Korea to be a tributary state, but she wanted China to be like a protector of Korea. More like it. Like just call for help, right? Mm-hmm. More like for help. So she opposed the Japanese a lot. She was actually anti-Japanese. And so because of this, a lot of Japanese officials, a lot of the Japanese officials in Korea decided, hey, she gotta go. We done with her already, and so etc. So ultimately, this made Gojong and his son, who was the crown prince, they ended up fleeing the palace, in which they would take refuge in the Russian legation.
She had a family before she was assassinated?
Of course she had a family. Everyone has a family.
I mean, you never know.
Everyone has a family. Yeah. Of course she had a family. She had a husband. She had a
I don't know. This is all news to me. So you telling me this is all news to me. I didn't know anything about that.
Yeah. So basically,
they take refuge.
Yeah. So basically, and this led to King Gojong in 1897, basically wanting to show Korea was equal to China and Japan. He ends up declaring the end of the Choson dynasty and the beginning of the Korean Empire, and declares himself emperor.
So Queen Min is one of the only government officials at the time to have wanted just China to be fully supporting, their endeavors, even though at that point they'd be making themselves a tributary state.
Mm-hmm. Queen Min was one of few officials that still wanted to have China still be kind of involved in Korean affairs.
Gotcha. Okay. So this all happens now. Imperialism is now headed towards all over Asia. What's happening at that point?
So basically, Japan, after learning examples from the Western countries, right? Western countries like Europe, they have empires around the world. They have colonies around the world. And learning from that, Japan wants to have their own empire, expanding into territories mainly for raw materials, particularly steel and oil. And so, because they've been getting it as an import, mainly from the U.S.
How are they making stuff at that point before steel? And was it all just...
I feel like with steel, it's not that they didn't have steel, because otherwise, how would you make katanas? How would you make swords? How would they have made the swords? Right?
But, there's bamboo swords for a reason.
That's only for training. But anyways, steel was kind of limited because, it's an archipelago. Japan's an archipelago, a country full of islands. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of limited, to steel. So they had to go outwards to look for steel.
Okay.
And oil as well, because there's really no oil in Japan, really. So they had to go outwards. So Japan wants to make an imperial push, and China would have been one of them, particularly Manchuria, but Korea, because of its richness of agricultural purposes. The rice grows well in Korea, basically.
Okay.
So they just want
geographically per se, it grows better there.
Yeah, geographically. So, but problems with Japan ended up coming about because,
They're now
It
more
wasn't-
autonomous.
Yeah, because it was in regards to claim that Korea should be under Japan's sphere of influence, rather than Russia's, because Russia kind of became involved in Korean affairs also, and this would eventually lead to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 05, in which Japan would also win as well in a fast and speedy war, and eventually because of the Treaty of Portsmouth.
Portsmouth. Okay.
Yeah, Portsmouth. Basically, Korea ends up becoming a protectorate state of Japan, and basically it all leads to 1910 when Korea would officially become a colony of Japan.
Okay. Okay, somewhat understanding of that. Okay, so that's all happening. Now it's a protectorate of Japan at that point. So what happens after?
So after the full colonization of Korea, basically a lot of Koreans began fleeing Korea into neighboring Manchuria, which is northeastern China, right? Basically the region above Korea, right? They end up fleeing there. And it was mainly the Koreans who were resisting the Japanese within Korea.
So I was gonna say, is
Yeah.
that just like not just like I wouldn't say Queen Minster hoarders, but just people in general that didn't want anything to do with democracy and like
Well, not democracy,
not democracy,
not
but
democracy.
like just
Which
Western ideas.
No, not with Western ideas, with Japan. They didn't want nothing to do with Japan.
Okay.
They wanted Japan out of the picture. They wanted Japan out. They didn't want Japan to have any control over them. They didn't want Japan to interfere in their political stuff, right? So a lot of the fighters ended up becoming known as righteous armies. And this comes from the idea of the righteous armies from the Indian Wars of 1592 to 98 when Japan invaded Korea to try to get to China. So righteous armies were made up of all classes, no matter what class you were, peasant, slave, middle class, aristocrat, it didn't matter. Basically, everyone was equal in the righteous army. So basically, because of...
But that all was being formed in when they flee to Manchuria?
No, it was a thing. It was actually a thing in Korea.
Oh, so it was within...
But it was like a secret... It's sort of like a secret society.
So within Korean territory. Okay.
Yeah. And then like after the full colonization of Japan, that's where, a lot of people decided to want to join them in fighting off the Japanese. And really the 1910s were the beginnings of the critical movements calling for Korean independence from Japanese control. And this was actually where assassinations would happen.
As far as who?
So basically assassinations of high-ranking Japanese officials, right? Like sort
within
of...
Korean territory? Like they were there in Korea, or just like they would go over to Japan?
It was either in Korea... It was in Korea, Manchuria, Russia, Japan.
So anytime they would see any Japanese officials, they would just... Okay.
That had anything to do with
imperialism as a whole.
Basically Japanese imperialism as a whole.
Okay. Interesting.
So I mean, yeah. It was pretty intense, especially like one of them was Ito Hirobimi. He was one of the prominent resident generals of Korea. Yeah, Ito Hirobimi. He was assassinated by a man by the name of An Jong-gun. He was one of the freedom fighters, resistance fighters to fight off to protest Japanese takeover of Korea, basically. So you basically have people like that. So you have Ito Hirobimi, who was assassinated in a place called Harbin, which was in Harbin in Russia.
Okay.
Because there was a meeting between Japan and Russian officials. Well, Harbin, it was like a border between China and Russia. So it was technically in China, but it was like a border.
Right.
So,
okay. So they were having a discussion
He was about to have a discussion. He was about to be in a meeting.
That never happened. Okay.
But it kind of never happened. But then also another Japanese official got assassinated in Tokyo Station by a Korean individual. Oh. So that's where it leads to, basically, like a lot of assassinations of high Japanese officials, etc., and trying to let the world know that, Korea wanted its independence from Japan.
Basically. They just wanted their own sovereignty at that point. Okay.
Exactly. And so it ends up leading to plans of things within Korea itself, especially protests. Just doing protests in general.
Okay.
And and of course, this is where we get to the big point, the March 1st movement. So the year is 1919. World War I had basically been over for like 2 years already. Mm-hmm. Almost 2 years. And so the 14 points come along with Woodrow Wilson. However, it did not favor Korea one bit. Yeah. Not one bit, because in the 14 points it opposed countries from. One of the points made was that European nations or nations that have colonies should give its colonies independence, right? And that one of the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles was that Germany's colonies had to be gone, that Germany was no longer allowed to have its colonies. And so the German colonies were given either independence or they were given to the countries that they were fighting against, basically. Okay. And of course, Korea was upset that not the United Nations, but the League of Nations, that the League of Nations did not tell Japan, hey, leave Korea, give Korea their independence. So what the Koreans ended up doing was doing their own.
Wait, protest. You said his 14 points said all of them, or just the ones from Germany itself?
No, he encouraged all nations to give up their colonies.
So then why not just have Japan also follow suit then? I would understand at that point what Japan, the Koreans are saying at that point.
Because Japan's one of the main allies of Japan. Japan was one of the main allies of the United States. The United States wanted to make Japan continue to be an ally to them. And because of all the treaties that were signed between them, etc. So basically it was sort of the United States agreed more with Japan. And in my opinion, the reason why for this is because Japan, like I said, Japan was the first one to decide to westernize willingly, to actually go with Western countries in modernizing the nation and basically acting more like Westerners in regards to treaties and etc.
See, I would understand now with Korea as a whole at that point in time to be rightfully pissed, because if you're asking, for example, Germany to give up all of its colonies and have them be sovereign, why not have the same be applied to Japan itself?
Yeah. So, the thing is, Japan, we were allies with Japan. Japan was allies with the Allies in World War I. So Japan fought against the Germans in their colonies that Germany had in Asia, like in China. So that's the reason why, because Japan was with the Allies during World War I.
I feel I don't know, if you're gonna make a point to have all countries be not punished, but at least have them give up something, I feel it should be applied to everyone. Because I don't know, it's all about fairness at that point.
And that was the issue. The European countries did not follow suit with almost all of the points that Woodrow Wilson made. The only thing they agreed with was the creation of the League of Nations.
That at that point. Say things changed at that point. It was March 1st, and Japan said, yeah. Then it would at least give others at that point, maybe, and this is a big if, it would have given others a sign oh, hey, the U.S. or Japan has high favors with the U.S. and they willingly decided to let Korea go and be its own sovereign place. Maybe at that point, if someone who was like basically the teacher's pet is rightfully giving that up, then maybe we should, because I don't know. That's just my point of view.
Well, no offense, but like the Japanese had too much pride back then. The Japanese were prideful. They wanted to view themselves as equals with Western countries because Western countries were still treating them more like crap. They were treating them. They still like Western countries kind of still view them as savages. They didn't fit in the hierarchy of being called like Western, known as like Western like or things like that, because they're in the end they're just like, well, they're Asian, like they're not like Caucasian, they're not white or things like that. So they were still, so Westerners still view them more like savages or like play about or like kind of like wannabe Westerners sort of thing. So this is why, and also like I said, Japanese culture was just so much different than Western culture, and of course, so because of this, a lot of leaders wanted to set up a protest in Seoul and other places within the country. And so the setting place was March 1st, 1919. The protest commenced, and a lot of these protesters were actually young people, like in their 20s, late teens.
Young adults at this point.
Mainly young adults at this point. And probably like people like in their 30s, probably like in their 30s and things like that, right? And one of these people I have to emphasize so much because this is also a figure that everyone needs to know, but Yu Guan-sun.
Yu
Guan-sun. She was one of these young protesters. She was in her late teens, probably 17 years old. And
starting to be a young adult.
17 years old, and she participated in the March 1st movement. She was like one of the main people that were calling for people to protest against Japanese rule, right? So she did one in Seoul, like probably like in Gwanghwamun, like in one of the main districts. But then 4 days later, she does one in Namdaemun, which is another district in Seoul. All right, she does a protest, but she ends up getting arrested. And the thing is, after she was arrested, the missionaries from her school, so she was a Christian, I think a Presbyterian, so she went to a Christian school. And, the missionaries were Westerners. They were Americans, I think, yeah.
So missionaries go over to her.
Yeah, to the jail, and they negotiated for her release, and she ends up returning home to her hometown of Chonan, which I've also been to. Chonan is a wonderful city. There's a lot of cafes there, particularly raccoon cafes.
Okay, I know what you're talking about.
But she goes back home to Shonan, and she continues to encourage the people in her town, but also in neighboring villages, to form their own protests, which they did. But it ultimately then led to Japan bringing the protests down, basically shooting and firing into the crowds. And unfortunately, one of the victims of that would have been Yu Guan-sun's parents. Would be victims of that. They would be killed by Japanese soldiers in these protests. Like
they went to the protest.
So they went to the protest, and then when the Japanese soldiers fired upon the protesters, Yu Guan-sun's parents were among them. They got shot. And then ultimately she would be arrested again, and this time she would be sent to Sodaemun prison in Seoul. She would be...
Go back to Seoul?
Yeah, she'll be... Because Sodaemun prison was like one of the main prisons that would hold independence activists.
Mm-hmm. A prison just for activists?
Mm-hmm. For independence activists, Sodaemun prison was the place for these people to go to be arrested. And I've actually been to Sodaemun prison before. Of my 2 times I went to Korea, I've always gone to Sodaemun prison. It's an interesting place. I mean, it's gloomy now. It looks gloomy, because of its bricks. It's all bricks. It looks like an asylum. But anyways, Sodaemun prison, she was taken there. Not good conditions. for like a year. She was tortured for a year, like tortured and beaten by the Japanese because of her activism, right? They tortured them, demanded that she give names of other people involved, etc. And so, but she held out, and then a year later, on the year anniversary of the March 1st movement, so in 1920, she ended up encouraging the women in her cell
to protest
in her building to do shears of Mansei, like hooray, long live Korean independence. It's more like que viva la independencia de Korea, viva, right?
Yeah,
sort of like the Latino,
the Latino version of Viva Mexico.
Yeah, like they are, right. So like she ended up encouraging her cell to do it. And the Japanese heard it, right? They're like, what the heck is going on? Blah, blah, blah. So they stormed the complex, right? They stormed the building.
They go to the cell block.
And then they went into the cell block, opened the door, and then they demanded, like, who started this? Like, who started this? Like, and then she comes forward and says, I did. It was me. So Yu Kwon-soon comes forward and without fear, says, it was me. I did it. And so the Japanese took her, right, take her away, and they beat her more, they tortured her more, etc. And then after that, a few months later, staying in Southern Moon, all this time, missionaries had tried to get her out of there too. But then
even when she got sent there again, trying to.
But but then eventually she would end up dying on that year on September 28th because of her injuries. And being tortured in Korean police quarters, Japanese run prisons was not a pretty thing because they did all types of torture to them. And so, like, fingernail pulling, waterboarding upside down, so they'll hang you upside down and they'll have the pot of water and they'll just drench you in it. Sometimes they'll literally just put chili peppers sometimes in the water and drench you in it. Tough confined spaces where you can't sit properly because, of course, that you can't sit properly, etc. And it was just a horrible place to be in. And I did see those. I did see like the torture chambers and all that in Southern Moon Prison. It was like eerie. It was like an eerie feeling in there. So it was like knowing how many people were tortured in there, like the unspeakable torture methods that were used against people. And so
that happens. She dies,
but then the story lives on, right? And of course, March 1st, now March 1st is considered as the March 1st Independence Movement Day in South Korea, where it is one of the national holidays celebrated in the country, just remembering the day Korea declared their independence from Japan. And of course, these activities are done, which is as follows: reading the Declaration of Independence in Tapgol Park in Seoul. Korean flags are seen everywhere. Like the patriotism is like everywhere in Korea. You see like Korean flags hanged everywhere. And in some places they host parades, they hold concerts, they hold exhibitions, in these exhibitions they actually do reenactments of the March 1st movement. So like they have the reenactments, like you have the protesters and then you have people dressed up as Japanese soldiers and then, like firing at them, etc. So, but I mean, that's something in Korean history that I think people don't know about, and I was happy to have shared that.
Thank you.
Right here.
Definitely got something out of that. I appreciate it. And thank you guys for staying through to the end. To those that did, thank you. Make sure to like and then comment what you liked about this episode. Anything that you guys want to add upon for this episode, or anything that or anything that you feel like we should bring up to discuss next time in future episodes.
And there will be more episodes This was just one bit of Korean history, but stay tuned for more of these of the episodes where I do talk about Korean history, etc., about different historical events. So yeah, just keep.
And so on our next episode, we will be briefly going over St. Patrick's Day and how it became a part of the American culture that you see today, as that time of the year does come up.
Exactly.
Thank you guys for joining us as we take a drink with the past.